Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So today we're moving on with our 108 gates of Dharma illumination, and today we're talking about gate 56. And the statement for today says, the four right exertions are a gate of Dharma illumination, for they eliminate all evils and realize many kinds of good. So there's a lot of ground to cover. There's a ton to say about this gate. This is a very old teaching in our tradition. It goes way back into the Pali Canon. It carries all the way forward through Dogen and to our teachers today. So sometimes these activities are called the four exertions, and sometimes they're called restraints. So in a minute, we'll see why that's true. So the Maghavibhanga Sutta says about the four right exertions, there is the case where a monk generates desire, endeavors, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the sake of the non-arising of evil, unskillful qualities that have not yet arisen, the sake of the abandonment of evil, unskillful qualities that have arisen, the sake of the arising of skillful qualities that have not yet arisen, the maintenance, non-confusion, increase, plenitude, development, and culmination of skillful qualities that have arisen. Those are the four. So in perhaps plainer language, we are working to prevent bad that has not yet occurred, to cause bad that has already occurred to be extinguished, to bring about good that has not yet occurred, and to promote the good that's already here. Right? So that makes it a little bit more understandable. So we can see why these are both exertions and restraints. We are actively promoting wholesomeness and we are restraining unwholesomeness. So we get involved both before things arise and after they're here, right? So we know what to do skillfully with things before they're before they've been generated and after we actually know that they're here. So we prevent bad from happening. We try to get rid of it when it arises. We encourage good to happen and we try to keep that around once it's here. So what is good and bad, or unwholesome and wholesome in the Buddhist tradition? Well, anything that causes suffering to ourselves and other beings is unwholesome. Anything that reduces suffering or brings joy to ourselves and others is wholesome. So that's the yardstick, right? That's the description. So the challenge is that the complete working of this kind of cause and effect is not always clear, right? We can't tell from looking at any one particular action whether it's good or not, whether the consequences and the karma and the unfolding that happened because of that are going to be wholesome or not. We also have to look at all the other related actions and consequences. And in this unsurpassable, interconnected universe, not possible in this human form, right? Very difficult thing to do. So we just vow to do our best in this moment after moment after moment. Our vow is to do these four exertions, right? To liberate beings from suffering, to generate good where we can, to reduce unwholesomeness where we can. If things go well, we don't attach to that good outcome as a sort of a validation of our own wisdom, our own compassion, or some means to build self, right? It's so easy to say, I did this thing, it did good for myself, it did good for others, I'm going to cling to that outcome. We just sort of offer that up. That's an offering to the universe. It's an offering to all beings. It's not about self, and we just do that and move on. So Buddha says doing the four exertions is both possible and conducive to benefit and pleasure. So it is actually something we can work on moment by moment by moment. It's not a magic world thing, something that happens somewhere else. You don't need to be a heavenly being in order to engage in this. And also, something pleasant comes out of it. There's some benefit, which is pleasurable, and something that is of benefit to other beings. In other words, it's possible and it's worthwhile. So working with the four exertions is associated with right effort on the Eightfold Path. We're all familiar with the Eightfold Path. This is where right effort happens. And the important thing about right effort is to pay attention to what kind of energy we're generating, whether that's wholesome or not, where that energy is going, because right effort is all about the energy, right? It's all about generating some kind of motive power. Where is that going? What are we doing with it? That's what we have to pay attention to for this. So to understand this whole thing, we have to take a bit of a detour and look at early teachings about the Eightfold Path. So Eightfold Path, of course, has 3 divisions. It has wisdom, ethics, and concentration. So all those 8, those 8 elements of the path fall into these 3 categories or these 3 divisions. So right effort falls into the section about concentration, along with right mindfulness and right samadhi, or right meditation, or right concentration. Right? So those 3 make up the concentration group. So right effort provides the energy. Right mindfulness is what gives it the stable awareness, and for right concentration. So effort and mindfulness are supporting concentration in this model, right? So we have some energy. Mindfulness keeps it kind of stable so that concentration can happen. So, that all sounds great, but again, that energy can go in any direction. So we have to pay attention to what we're doing with that. It has to work together with right view and right intention on this path in order that it's directed toward wholesomeness and directed toward awakening, because energy can lead to desire, aggression, violence, ambition on one hand, the unwholesome stuff, or on the other hand, it can lead to generosity and self-discipline and kindness and compassion, right? And, understanding on the other side. So it's not an unmitigated good, right? Energy can be powerful, and we have to pay attention to where that's going. So if we're not careful about where we put energy, then we can get caught up in some unwholesome mental states. So we can think, I'm practicing, I'm generating energy, this is terrific. And if we're directing that into some unwholesome places, we're not helping, right? There's actually not something helpful happening. So, on that basis, we can take actions that perpetuate some unwholesome karma. We can create some suffering. We can perpetuate that suffering on other beings rather than directing that into action that moves ourselves and others towards awakening. So effort rises again and again as a theme in Buddha's teachings because each of us has to do our own practice. Our teachers can't practice for us. Buddha's not going to come over the hill and, zap us and do it for us. Effort is important. Energy is important because each of us has to do this thing for ourselves. It's not a case where, somebody hands us a scripture and we read the scripture and a light bulb goes off. We really have to put in the work. So paying some attention to where our energy goes and how we're generating that is an important part of our practice. So, Buddha and our teachers point out the path. It's up to us to actually put those teachings into practice. So this is why, for instance, Dharma study by itself is not quite enough. We actually have to get on the cushion. We actually have to do the Zazen piece and the work piece of Zazen work and study. Somebody has to do that action, and that's us. So we have to start with investigating how our own 3 poisonous minds, how our own delusions, our own hindrances arise. Where do those things come from? How do they take shape? Then we have to make effort to see through those, right? And to release ourselves from making mistakes and causing suffering and sort of, creating unwholesomeness for ourselves and others simply because of our own ignorance, because we're not paying attention and because we don't understand. I feel angry. Why? I'm stuck in this poison of greed. Why? We have to look at the arising of those things. So taking each of those 4 exertions individually, the first one, preventing the arising of unwholesome states. Well, the point of this in the early teachings is to get rid of things that cause distraction for us in our practice, particularly in our sitting practice, right? So specifically here, we're talking about the 5 hindrances. So you may have run across the 5 hindrances. This is where they fit into the larger picture. So sensual desire, ill will, dullness and drowsiness, restlessness and worry, and doubt. I will take each of those individually. So if you're taking notes, you have another chance. Sensual desire, ill will, dullness and drowsiness, restlessness and worry, and doubt. So these first 2 hindrances, sensual desire and ill will, are said to be the strongest of the set. Why? Because they represent greed and aversion. So they represent the most basic kind of delusion, right? We're right back to the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. So the other 3 hindrances are said to be a little bit less toxic, but they are still problematic, of course, because they're offshoots of delusion. They are usually mixed up with other kinds of defilements. It's not necessarily, so straightforward what we're experiencing. So all these things are a problem. The first 2 tend to be the strongest ones. So sensual desire is interpreted in 2 ways. Sometimes it's a craving for things coming in through the senses that we label as pleasant, right? We've talked here about things come in through the sense gates, almost immediately we make a judgment, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. So this kind of sensual desire, sensual craving, is wanting things that come in through those sense gates. We immediately say, that's pleasurable, that's good for me, and we grab it. That's what we're talking about here. That's one way to interpret sensual desire. The other way is sort of a just general craving for whatever. Like whatever we think we want, not only good sensations, but power and money and nice belongings and social status and all those things that human beings want. So it could be quite specific. It could be just this general, like, I want stuff, right? This overall craving, this overall attachment. The second hindrance of ill will is about the other side of craving, and that's aversion, right? We know craving and aversion are two sides of the same thing. It simply means I want things to be different than they are. I want things I don't have, or there are things in my life that I wish I didn't have. So sensual desire, ill will, two sides of the same thing. Craving and aversion, two sides of the same thing. So ill will includes hatred, anger, resentment, every kind of pushing things away, every kind of I don't want this. Whether we're suppressing feelings we don't want, or avoiding people we don't like, we're trying to get out of jobs we don't want to do. It's any kind of repulsion, any kind of pushing away is caught up in this hindrance. So this could be directed toward other people. It could be directed toward ourselves. There's parts of me I don't really like very much. It could be about objects. It could be situations. It could be anything that we just want to avoid. So the third hindrance, dullness and drowsiness. Well, it feels like the opposite of energy and exertion, right? This is just inertia. It's a kind of heaviness of the mind. It's, I just want to sleep. I don't want to do things, right? The fourth hindrance, restlessness and worry, is kind of the other side of that. So this is the unquiet mind. This is the mind of agitation and excitement, and our mind is jumping quickly from thought to thought to thought. This restlessness is like we just don't settle. Or the second piece of this thing is worry. We're worried, or we are remorseful about past mistakes. I did something in the past, I generated some harmful karma, I'm anxious about what's going to be the outcome of that. So I never quite settle. I'm worried, I'm anxious all the time, right? Okay. The fifth hindrance is doubt. And doubt, of course, is about indecisiveness. So rather than committing to practice, rather than really committing to investigating the self and the rest of reality, we can't commit because we've got some kind of lingering doubts about this whole practice thing. I'm not sure it's wholesome. I'm not sure I can do it. I'm not sure it's going to lead to anything. I'm not sure this is the one true way. Whatever we're feeling doubt about, there's doubt. There's indecisiveness. So those are the five hindrances. Those five hindrances aren't coming from someplace else. They are not being imposed on us by outside forces. They are not contained within the things that we encounter. These are things that, we have karmic conditions. And because we have karmic conditions, we have these tendencies for these things to arise. So when a cause appears, these hindrances arise. So, these are things we're generating on our own. These are our own reactions and responses to things that we encounter. So the problem is not the object of our senses. That's not the problem. Ultimately, the nature of that object that we're encountering is suchness. But what are we doing with it, right? That's not where delusion lies. The problem is what we do with the sensory information that we get when we have some sense contact with that object or that situation or whatever that is. So we create this immediate overall impression, again, that this thing is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. We cling to that conclusion. We write a lot of stories about it. We start exploring the details of that object or situation or whatever that is, or our perception of what that is that we're encountering. And then some interesting things start to happen. Because of greed, we can become fascinated by things that we think are agreeable. I encounter something and boy, I really fall in love with it. Or I'm really infatuated with it, or, I'm clinging tightly to this thing. On the other hand, because of aversion, we can be completely repulsed by something we encounter that we find disagreeable. And again, that's our story. That ill will or that impulse to push away or those emotions that arise are not contained in this thing that I don't like. It's all here. So, we start really digging in, exploring, clinging to the details of that thing, which simply multiplies and perpetuates our delusions because we're simply writing more and more complicated stories. So instead, can we just be aware of whatever it is that we're encountering? Can we process what's happening without getting hijacked, right? Without inserting a lot of our own stuff that really distorts the picture and keeps us from taking some kind of skillful action, right? We know we're going to write a story. Can we watch ourselves doing that? Can we see what's going on? Okay, that's the first exertion. Second exertion, abandoning unwholesome states once they arise. So first, we're going to try to prevent these things from arising. Now they're here anyway somehow, right? Despite our best intentions, we still notice there's something unwholesome that has arisen, and we want to make that disappear. So Buddha had a remedy for each of those 5 hindrances that we just talked about, and 4 hindrances as a whole. So one is to replace the unwholesome thought with the opposite wholesome thought, whatever the opposite wholesome form is. So if we're struggling with grasping and desire and sensual kind of clinging, right, we can consider the impermanence or the instability of whatever it is that we're clinging to. We know ultimately that's not happiness because it's going to change. Either it's going to change in its form or it's going to leave us or whatever that is. If we're struggling with ill will, we can consider loving kindness. We can generate the wish that all beings be well and happy. That doesn't hurt us. We encounter something we're not so happy to encounter. It's no cost to ourselves to wish for wholesomeness, for well-being, for peace and well-being. If we're struggling with dullness and drowsiness, especially that happens in our sitting practice, sometimes some kinhin or some brisk walking can help. Sometimes it's simply about renewing our vows, renewing our aspiration to stay with it. We all know if we're sitting sesshin, we're tired. We're not getting a lot of sleep. We're sitting 14 periods a day. We know there's tiredness there, and we know where it comes from. And it's not that that's necessarily a lifelong hindrance. If we notice on a regular basis, as soon as I get on the cushion, I'm feeling drowsy, or just in my life, I don't feel like I can move forward. What can we do to generate some energy to kind of offset that? Whether that is becoming somehow supporting our aspiration and renewing our aspiration to actually do the practice that we vowed to do, or do we physically have to take care of the body? Like, do we actually just need more sleep? Or sometimes I have to think, if we're sitting and we're becoming aware of things in our psyches or in ourselves that we're not so happy to look at, I kind of think sometimes the body throws up some drowsiness just to protect us. So on the one hand, it's like we like to see through that drowsiness because we want to do the practice. On the other hand, the body's going, oh, that's painful. It kind of wants to put us to sleep. So I think dullness and drowsiness is kind of interesting. I think there's a really sort of obvious level, and I think there's less obvious levels, and we get to really look carefully there and say, what's actually going on? To counteract that, what's actually going on? For restlessness and worry, of course, we can calm down by mindfulness of breathing. If I notice I'm having anxiety, whether I'm on the cushion or off the cushion, sometimes it is as simple as, not always, but sometimes it's as simple as paying attention to the breathing, because that's, of course, a physical manifestation of what's going on up here. There may be other things we need to do about anxiety. If we've got some chronic anxiety, that's something perhaps we need to address. But if it's simply a matter of I'm on the cushion, I'm feeling restless, I'm feeling worried, pay attention to the breathing as part of a posture check-in. What else am I doing with this body? Am I sitting upright? Am I breathing well? Am I doing the 4 things we need to do in shikantaza? Finally, for doubt, well, we can investigate teachings. We can do what we're doing right now, which is a little bit of Dharma study. We can work on the practice. We can ask questions of our teachers and Sangha friends. We can engage in some investigation of what did the Buddha teach? What did Dogen teach? If we have doubts, and that's a human thing. It's not that we shouldn't have doubt. This is not a spiritual practice where we're supposed to simply take what's said and go, that's it. I think investigating is something we never stop doing. If we're not approaching our practice with the spirit of inquiry, I think we're kind of missing something, right? So if we have doubt from time to time, I think that's not I think that's the human condition, and that's an opportunity for us to investigate the practice a little bit. So in general, it is said that there are 3 ways to work with these hindrances that are clamoring for our attention, right, that are creating some distraction. So one is we consider that what's arising is unwholesome. It's going to have some unwholesome consequences. If I'm really feeling, ill will, that's going to have some unwholesome consequences. I need to investigate what's happening here. Second way is to redirect our attention from the unwholesome condition to the opposite wholesome condition. Can I generate loving kindness? Third one is to accept and acknowledge what's happening, right? This is basic working with suffering, right? This is Bodhisattva 101. We accept what's happening. We acknowledge what's going on. We look at it head on. What is actually happening here? That is not easy for hindrances that are painful. We don't want to look at those things head on. We would like to say they're not happening, or they're not important, or yeah, I'll get to that someday. Our Bodhisattva practice is be very clear about what's actually going on. So, we investigate where it's coming from. We investigate how it's arising. We look carefully at what we're doing with it. We are not psychoanalyzing ourselves on the cushion. We all know that, right? Sometimes we've got to make a mental note and say, when I get up off the cushion, I maybe need to talk to somebody about this thing. At the moment of Zazen, that is not about psychoanalysis. And on the other hand, in our practice, we need to be aware what's happening here, what's happening out there. So working back up now, these 5 hindrances make up the unwholesome states that we're told to prevent in the first exertion and to abandon in the second exertion. So we see how these things are connected, tied together. Okay, third exertion, encouraging wholesome states to arise. Well, our practice is full of teachings and full of activities about generating wholesome circumstances, right? Most of our practice is designed to make this thing possible. So everything from the Eightfold Path to the 4 foundations of mindfulness that we just got through looking at in the last 4 talks, lots of supports, teachings, guidances, pointers there toward how do we encourage wholesome states to arise. So there is also something called the 7 factors of enlightenment in this tradition. They are, don't worry about these, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but just so you know what they are. Mindfulness, investigation of phenomena, energy, rapture, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. Now you can go out and find those 7 factors of enlightenment. If I talked about those, it would be a whole other Dharma talk. We'd get pulled away today. Investigating that might be worthwhile. I'm not going to do it now. Suffice it to say that applying ourselves to our practice is not different from establishing and maintaining wholesome conditions, right? It's kind of the whole point of what we're doing here. So those 7 factors are said to lead to awakening and also to be the manifestations of awakening. So even in these early texts, we're getting this preview of Dogen saying practice enlightenment, not 2 things, right? It's starting all the way back with these 7 factors of enlightenment. However, in these early teachings, this thing is a linear path. Mindfulness leads to investigation of phenomena, leads to cultivation of energy, We know that our more immediate ancestors would say that these factors arise together, right? Or that many factors of our practice arise together. It's not a question of, going up a series of steps. So it's not linear. But in early teachings, that's slightly different. Okay, 4th exertion, maintaining wholesome states once they arise. So it said that this is simply the maturing and strengthening of these 7 factors of enlightenment. In other words, we continue to practice. Our practice matures, we get a little stronger, a little more experienced in practice. That's how this 4th exertion happens. So there's another very old text with something to say about restraining unwholesomeness and encouraging wholesomeness, and that's the Dhammapada, which might be more familiar to you than the Maghavibhanga Sutta. So the Dhammapada, of course, is a collection of short poems. It's considered to be one of the oldest written scriptures we have. So that means it existed before Buddhism divided up into schools and sects, right? This is at the very beginning of the tradition. So the Dhammapada contains a famous poem called The Verse of the Teachings of All 7 Buddhas. I'm sure you have heard this. Not doing of any evil, doing of all good deeds, purification of one's own mind. This is the teaching of all Buddhas, right? So our tradition says, of course, that there were 7 Buddhas before Shakyamuni. So this is supposed to be the teaching well before Shakyamuni. With all 7 Buddhas, this is what the 7 Buddhas were teaching. So again, those first 2 lines, not doing of any evil, doing of all good deeds, sounds pretty familiar, right? And that's pretty clear. Don't do bad stuff, only do good stuff. That's pretty obvious what's going on there. The 3rd line about purification of one's own mind has various different interpretations. One of the traditional ones is going beyond good and bad. So that means not clinging to unwholesomeness, but also not clinging to wholesomeness. And that seems a bit counterintuitive, right? So this verse contains 2 levels of teachings. It says we should do good and not do evil, and also we should go beyond good and evil. So what does that mean? In early Buddhism, this first part about good and evil was for lay people, and the one about going beyond good and evil was only for monks, because we know circumstances were a little bit different in early teaching. So only the monks could practice and go beyond good and evil and, sort of end up in nirvana, and they were not supposed to be really involved with the world. They were living a different kind of a life. Lay people were supposed to stay within this cycle of transmigration. Their job was give to the monks to support them in their quest for nirvana, and for a lay person, the only way to achieve that was to be reborn as a monk or become a monk, right? So the role of the laity was to support the monks while they worked for nirvana. So in the Mahayana, of course, that doesn't work, right? Because Mahayana doesn't make a big distinction between monks and laity when it comes to awakening. We all take the same precepts, we all do the same practice. We don't make much of a distinction there. So, it doesn't make sense that the first 2 are about the laity and the second one is about the monks. So somehow those 2 points of view had to be integrated, right? How to do good and not do bad, and also go beyond good and bad. So the 4 exertions are telling us to restrain unwholesomeness and encourage wholesomeness, and of course we should do that. But as soon as we create a yardstick to measure good and bad, we start attaching to our good deeds. This thing is good, this thing is bad, I did this good thing, therefore I'm a good person, or therefore I deserve a reward, or people should think well of me, or something, right? Immediately we have this clinging. So it's a kind of counterintuitive thing. We're told we should do good, and yet not hang on to the good, and also not cling to the bad. We do good and bad on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis. That's a good thing. But if we ignore the difference between good and bad, that's also a problem. So, where do we even stand up in the middle of this thing? So the last time, when I talked about emptiness, I mentioned that Nagarjuna said that when we attach only to the absolute perspective, that's the sickness of emptiness. And here we are again. We still have to live in the world, and what we do makes a difference. So how can we just do good without clinging to our good deeds, and try not to do evil, and try not to judge ourselves and others, and try to cling to an outcome? It's a challenge, right? So there's both an internal and an external aspect to today's gate about these 4 exertions. The oldest meaning of the 4 exertions is that in our personal practice, we try to understand the nature of our delusion and the nature of our suffering so that we can prevent them from rising and liberate ourselves when they do arise. So it's all very much about what's happening here. How do we not get distracted? How do we not get pulled off course? How do we really understand what's arising here so that we can either keep bad things from arising or abandon them once they have? So likewise, we try to understand, in addition, when we're looking at delusion, that's part of it. We also need to understand, how do wisdom and compassion arise? How do we generate those things? How do we cultivate them in our hearts and minds and perpetuate them when they do arise? So all of that's important. That's internal work, and we need to do that. But we also can aspire to do these things in the outer world, in the community, right? As we're moving through our day-to-day, job sites and, whatever we're doing in the world with our families, we can try to head off suffering when that's possible, and we can help people who may be already facing some kind of difficulty. So we can also try to make good things happen in the world and keep wholesomeness happening once that whole thing gets started. So it's clearly a case of, as Hojo-san has said, needing to both take a step back to study the self and to take a step forward to help people in the world, or to do things in the world that are important. So he says, we may practice zazen to pacify or calm ourselves, but that is not enough. We have to engage in the activity of our day-to-day lives. Right? So we can't just retreat to a cave and never come out. we also can't just be busy in the world without looking at what's happening here. So we get to hold both of these things. So one of the places we look for guidance about our actions is precepts, of course. Indeed, the threefold pure precepts have something to say about this gate. So when we do formal meals, one part of our chant before we eat is the first portion is to end all evil, the second is to cultivate every good, the third is to free all beings. May we all realize the Buddha way, right? So right there, then we eat 3 bites from each bowl, and then we go on to eat whatever we're going to eat. So there's a whole reminder built into our meals about threefold pure precept. So this chant is making a reference to those: embracing moral codes, embracing all good actions, embracing all living beings, right? There they are. So embracing moral codes is not different from refraining from unwholesome deeds. And embracing all good actions is not different from practicing all wholesome deeds. And embracing all living beings simply means that we live together with everybody, with all the living beings. We don't harm anybody. So now we get to talk about Dogen and what he had to say about all of this. You knew this was coming, right? We started in the very early days, and you knew we were going to make our way up to Dogen. So here we go. So if you come to our monthly Ryakusatsu ceremony where we renew our aspiration to follow the precepts, you will always hear me read the Kyoju Kaimon, which is comments on teaching and conferring the precepts. So this is a text that contains Dogen's teaching, but he didn't personally write it. It was actually teachings that he gave that were written down by his disciple named Eicho. So it's Dogen's teaching, but it's not his actual writing. So there is a statement there about each of these 3 pure precepts. So the precept of embracing moral codes, this is the abode of the laws and codes of all Buddhas. This is the root source of the laws and codes of all Buddhas. So sometimes this is known as the precept of avoiding all evil acts, which makes some sense. So it's the same as keeping bad from arising or abandoning unwholesomeness once it's arisen. So abiding by the precepts, we avoid doing unwholesome stuff. Dogen says this precept is the origin of all the other precepts, as well as all the forms and rituals that we do in our practice. They all come down to this one thing, the precept of embracing moral codes, which is kind of interesting. It's not really a regulation or a rule, but something that points to the reality of all beings. This is simply the manifestation of the reality of this, sort of one universe, because of interdependent origination. So this is reality already here. We are already completely connected with everything else. So it's not possible to do something unwholesome and get some benefit for ourselves, and while other beings are suffering. It's not possible to separate ourselves out this way. If I do, some unwholesome thing thinking that's good for me and I don't care if other beings are suffering, it's not a clear view of reality. We're not functioning with right view. So if we really get that, we don't feel motivated to do the unwholesome thing or to do the bad thing. We can already see there's some unfortunate consequences there. It's not a long-term solution to my happiness or my contentment. So, this is really at the heart of our practice, right? This precept is really at the heart of what it means to be a bodhisattva, what it means to understand the Four Noble Truths, what drives our practice, and determines how we move through the world, so we can see why Dogen is saying this is the origin of all of it, right? This is the center of everything. So not doing evil is the root or origin of Buddha's laws and codes, and it's also the abode or the manifestation of Buddha's laws and codes, right? So both of those things. The precept of embracing beneficial actions, Kyoju Kaimon says, this is the Dharma of unsurpassable true awakening, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. This is the way in which one should practice by oneself and the way in which one should lead others. So this is the same as encouraging and sustaining good or wholesomeness. So Dogen says that doing wholesome things is itself awakening. If we're clear about the true nature of reality and we're clear about the 3 marks of existence, interdependence, impermanence, no self, then what arises naturally is wholesomeness rather than unwholesomeness. Until we can see with the eyes of Buddha, we have precepts, we have guidelines, we have teachings, that help us to stay on track. But simply not doing unwholesome stuff is already awakening. Awakening is already there. So, third of the threefold pure precepts, the precept of embracing all living beings. One should transcend distinction between ordinary beings and sages and save both oneself and others. So I'm also not going to spend a lot of time on this one today. Again, it could be a whole, additional Dharma talk. I'll just say that embracing all living beings is another reference to interconnectedness, right? Doing good or doing harm affects the entire network of beings. So our own wholesomeness or unwholesomeness doesn't stop here. It affects the entire network of all the beings. So making effort for good and making effort for restraining unwholesomeness is working for the universe as a whole, right? So it would seem that all of that is pretty self-evident. Do good, don't do bad. Positive things will happen as a result. But as we've seen, it is not that simple. Dogen says we also have to let go of even our desire to step through this gate of the four exertions. We have to even let go of our clinging to wanting to do good and encourage good and restrain unwholesomeness and get rid of it. Because it's already clinging, right? Clinging is already a delusion. So even though we're being encouraged to live in this way and to practice in this way, we also can't cling to it. So Hojo-san says, any good or bad deed has its own result, and that's not the end. There's an endless cycle within good and bad, and in order to reach nirvana, we should be free from the motivation of doing good in order to get a good result, and trying not to do bad things in order to avoid going into hell. On that basis, we are endlessly transmigrating in a circular experience. So it's possible to create delusion for ourselves, even as we're, having some aspiration to work with the four exertions and to do the right thing. We can still, because of this, human form, we can still get caught up in our stuff. So Dogen says if we cling to emptiness as an excuse to do something bad because there's no distinction between good and bad, then that kind of teaching is the suggestion of demons. I think that's great. So not doing evil isn't really a precept or a sort of a man-made rule or a man-made guideline. It is awakening itself. It is a complete manifestation of reality. So not only that, the four exertions, he says, are not something we do by ourselves. They happen because we're living together with all beings throughout space and time. So if these four exertions are a description, a manifestation of awakening, then of course they're not mine, right? Of course it's happening within this larger network of interdependent origination. So this is not, it's kind of like Zazen. We say Zazen is not something we do by ourselves. It's not an individual activity. These four exertions are also not an individual activity. And yet somehow we can get caught up in delusion in the midst of that and sort of hindrance, right? So Dogen also gave a little talk on this that was recorded in the Eihei Koroku. Don't you see that the world-honored one said, you bhikshus already abide in the precepts. Restrain the five faculties and do not allow yourselves to indulge and enter into the five desires. For example, this is like a person who tends an ox, holding a staff and keeping watch so that it never violates the seedlings in others' fields. If we indulge the five senses, then the five desires will simply grow beyond all bounds and go beyond all control. Therefore, the descendants of Buddha ancestors should not direct themselves on the evil paths of sounds and colors or fame and profit. Not directing oneself towards sounds and colors means that you should immediately discard fame and profit and make the five faculties sharp and clear. To be sharp and clear means that once we hear that we should discard fame and profit and should discard self-centeredness, we immediately discard them. Such practitioners functioning and have superior qualities. People who cannot yet be like this are called inferior vessels. This being the case, how can we tend an ox? How is the staff? How are the seedlings? How is our watching? And how is the master of the seedlings? Worldly people certainly do not know this. It is only correctly transmitted by the Buddha ancestors. So here we are back again at managing the five hindrances, right? We've made the loop and we've come full circle and we're back to the five hindrances and making right effort to watch where our energy is going, right? So, this is the way a person tends an ox. If we let the ox run wild, it makes mistakes. It tears up the neighbor's fields, tramples on all the seedlings or maybe eats them. If we pay attention, the ox is fine, the seedlings are fine, the neighbor is fine, we're fine, things are good. So, how can we tend an ox? How is the staff? How are the seedlings? How is our watching? And how is the master of the seedlings? We get to watch all of those things, right? Energy goes to all of those things. So how is that going? When Dogen says worldly people certainly do not know this, it is only correctly transmitted by Buddhas and ancestors. He's telling us that the only way to take care of wholesomeness and unwholesomeness and to sort of go through this gate of 4 exertions is to apply ourselves to our practice. So what would you like to say this morning about the 4 exertions, or good and evil, which is a long conversation in itself, or whatever else is bubbling for you today? And be sure to unmute yourself so we can hear you. If I don't see you, just jump in. No one's caught up in good and evil and delusion today. That's good news. I'm pleased to say it. Mark.
I'm actually quite caught up in delusion. So, and I'm trying to think like how I'd want to be able to phrase this, kind of in a question, because I think that one of the things that I'll have, in my own spiritual life, I sometimes think it's like, before I got into practicing Zazen and practicing Zen, I would just kind of stumble into walls all the time. Now I walk soberly right into them. And so this is, a lot of what, you're saying is something that I think like really appeals, because I can see delusion in my coming up, see it clearly for what it is, and still get hung up on it. And there is, one of those pieces that you said that, Dogen, mentioned, actually clinging to the idea of getting beyond that is actually clinging in and of itself, an attachment in and of itself. And that's like one of those things is that you can it's easy to get frustrated with your spiritual practice, because this is like, I'm supposed to be beyond this now. I'm supposed to have surpassed this type of toxic thinking, yet here I am, caught up in these delusions. I see it happening and I still get hung up on it. And so like, that's a part of me. I don't know what the question is, but that's a part of me that I'm grappling with like right now. And so that kind of thing, what you said about where Dogen said like, about like, well, you getting attached to that idea of getting beyond that is still attachment in and of itself. And so that's something that I think kind of really speaks to me at this point in this moment.
Well, I think it's a wonderful illustration of why this is a lifelong transformative practice and why we don't just sit down one time and go, there, I get it. And I never make another mistake, right? It's the same thing that happens in our Zazen. We keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back. And what we may notice is that the questions or the delusions or the walls we're bumping into become more and more subtle. And maybe that varies just, today I'm up here on the course level and tomorrow I'm here on the fine level, or it might be a question of just, I've been practicing long enough that I know myself well enough. Oh, here's that thing again, right? We're always going to have that. It's why we do vow and repentance. It's why we accept that as bodhisattvas, our practice is never complete. So it's possible to become frustrated and think that our progress is not where it ought to be. And then guess what? We're clinging to another idea. Guess what? We're clinging to a yardstick that says, by now I should be here and I'm only here. Well, who says, right? This moment is this moment. What's going on in this moment is what's happening here. So we can be sitting Zazen or studying the Dharma or working in the community for 30 years and still run into, here's that thing again, right? We have some pretty deeply rooted karmic conditioning, which we're probably never going to completely uproot, right? So one of the challenges of this human form is that we need to do vow and repentance because we know we're never going to be done. However, I think, more often than not, I will hear somebody in a conversation like this saying, I now recognize this delusion. And up to this point, I didn't even realize unwholesomeness was there. I just took for granted that this is the way the world is, and this is the way the world works. And, it never occurred to me to look more deeply to say, why do I believe what I believe? Why am I seeing what I'm seeing? Why do I feel compelled to take this action to create this karma? Maybe there's something I can understand about this. Maybe there's some way to head off that unwholesomeness, right? So if we want some encouragement in our practice on the days where we're clinging to the yardstick, the fact that we're aware of delusion is like not a small thing. Because before we came to practice, I think on some level we maybe knew there's some unhappiness, there's some dukkha, there's some unsettledness, there's some something, but we didn't really know why, and we didn't know how to look at it. kind of didn't know what to do with it. And now maybe armed with some teachings and some guidance and some precepts and some wisdom and compassion from Buddhas, we kind of know how to approach that. So there's a little bit of encouragement there, I think. It's like if I'm trying to get this body into shape and and I do some exercise and I hurt the next day, it's like, well, okay. I'm aware that there was something there that probably needed some work, and I'm not happy that I have pain, but it's better than ignoring my physical condition, right? So yeah, frustration is there. There's no question. And it seems like whatever we're doing in our practice, there's always one more thing we can let go of, which is why a phrase like opening the hand is so helpful, right? It doesn't matter what we're doing. We can be, practicing for 50 years. There's still something we get to let go of. So I think knowing that, we can manage our expectations. I hope a little bit. Mark, anything you want to follow up on there, or things that other people would like to say?
Thank you.
Other thoughts from folks today? Hoshin.
This thankfully takes me back to when I first started practicing a long time ago, and thinking about how it brings me back to the fundamentals of this. The times that I have taught getting started always brings me back. And one of the things I always think about is that there is a kind of maintenance mind that you get into with this. And I think about in discussions early on about what practice is about is maintaining a kind of zeal and enthusiasm for practice, which can be really hard to do. And that came around to having an idea about no self-negotiation. Getting up in the morning, okay, you sit. No talking yourself out of it. You just do it. You just do it. And I guess it's just that idea of once you're committed, you just know that this is what you do. And so you don't trip up constantly. Of course you do anyway, but it's, so that's just my comment about this. And it just goes back again and again and again to the fundamentals.
Yeah. Well, anyone who has sat session with me knows that one of the first things I say, or one of the things I say during orientation, is you've made the commitment to be here. You've put aside these 3 days or 5 or 7 days. You can stop negotiating with yourself now about, I don't want to be here, I want to be somewhere else. At home, there's something happening, I should be working. It's like you've made the choice. You can kind of, that part of your mind, you can put that to bed because you're committed to be here. It's the same when we're sitting and, we've decided we're going to sit for 50 minutes and we sit down. In the zendo, you're not likely to decide I've had enough and wander away. When we're all sitting at home by ourselves, wow. I mean, the stuff Hoshin's talking about really rises up. It is so easy to say nobody's looking. Unless you're me. Or Hoshin, who has to be here in the morning. It is so easy to say, well, it doesn't really matter, and I'll just take the day off, and if I sit 10 minutes or 50, right? So it can be really hard. I think this is one of the reasons Sangha is important. Even if you don't have a formal commitment with your Sangha friends to say we're going to meet at a certain time and sit virtually, there's something about, well, I'm going to show up because other people are showing up. And I know that if I show up, it's energy, it's wholesome energy that supports other people's practice, right? So yeah, coming back to those fundamentals, that's important. And especially in these times where we're feeling pulled to do other things, we don't maybe feel tremendously supported in some ways in our practice. Yeah, it's easy to just say, there isn't enough wholesomeness there for me to make the commitment to get on the cushion, and I hope we don't feel that way. If you do, please reach out to a Sangha friend, call up somebody else, in your Sangha and agree to sit together or have a conversation or, join in a Dharma study or do something. Because generating energy is not a small thing. And if we're feeling tired and discouraged anyway, that's a rabbit hole, isn't it? We can just sort of walk away. And we know once we break the habit of practice, it is that much harder to come back. I'm sure all of us know Sangha members that used to practice at one time, and then life intervened. They had children, they got a new job, they got out of the habit, and 2 years go by before we see them again. And it's like, oh, they're back. What happened? Life gets in the way. So to have the commitment to sit down and actually do the practice is not a small thing. But my hope is that we understand that it's creating wholesomeness in the world, both for ourselves and for other beings, that's really important. And in some ways, the harder that becomes, the more important it is. What would others like to say? Mahesh.
Yeah, so this is a little bit timely, like morning, sitting in my zazen, and then like there's no focus, and I was thinking, oh, this is not working, and the doubt or these things start coming up, and so it's useful in that sense. But again, I think like, what if my doubts are real? Like what if this is not working out, and then this framework has a way to like just put all those things down and say like whatever comes up, let it go, right? Like it can be a bad thing in a way, or not a bad thing. What I mean is like, yeah, I mean, you can convince yourself whatever is happening, you can convince yourself that this is the way or path, right? But what if this is really not working? What if like your karmic conditions are not, you're not ready there yet? And I mean, for people who are ready, they start seeing results and then they're motivated. But what if, that's not there.
Well, that's difficult, isn't it? Because we all want to see some kind of progress, and we all want to see some kind of results. So I think if there are doubts about the teachings, we can investigate that. We can do some Dharma study, we can talk with teachers, we can, all of that. If there are doubts about what the Buddha is saying actually is a reflection of this one unified reality, that stuff we can kind of investigate in that way. I think if we're sitting down every day or we're trying to practice every day and what we're looking for is a result, I want to feel better, I want to be a person I like better, all those things, there is some clinging there. We know, because this isn't a case where we sit down one time and get it, it's the water wearing away the stone. And we may not see some kind of result for a long time, if ever, or we might not see a result that we can recognize. And I think that's where we have to remind ourselves that we're not practicing for ourselves alone, that Zazen isn't something we're doing as individuals. We are joining in with, perpetuating some wholesomeness in the world because we're not doing it individually. But I do think if we investigate this practice and we wholeheartedly make some commitment to have a spirit of inquiry, and after some period of time it just doesn't fit, bless you and move on. Right? I don't think the Buddha ever wanted us to commit to a practice because we felt like we should, or because there was peer pressure to do it, or all these reasons we can convince ourselves that we ought to practice, right? If somehow it doesn't feel right, I think it's okay to say this isn't the time, or these aren't the circumstances. So for some folks, they feel that the teachings are absolutely right on, but the Sangha they're in doesn't fit them, or the teacher they have doesn't speak in a way that resonates with them, or there's some conditions around their practice that just don't feel supportive. And then it may be time to figure out what's missing, or what's happening that feels toxic, or something. And it can happen. Any human community can have some undercurrents in it, that are not wholesome. I've seen it happen. People will leave sanghas or practice in more than one sangha because they get something out of each one. So maybe we have to make a distinction between, what is the teachings and the practice, and whether the things surrounding the teachings and the practice, is it the style that isn't working? Are there some expectations on the part of teachers or sanghas that aren't working? Is it some expectation I have of my own practice that I need to investigate? But certainly, I think it's really easy to feel if we find ourselves in toxic circumstances. I've seen it happen in sanghas because they're human communities. There can be a fair amount of peer pressure to not say anything and to not leave, and to just say, well, the teacher is a fully realized being and is doing things I don't understand, but it must be beyond my understanding, and therefore, even if it's harmful, I'm not, I can't judge. Well, I think there are times where there's something happening and we need to say this is not okay. So I think there's a number of ways to kind of work with that. If I'm having doubts about practice, I can investigate teachings, I can talk with other people, I can look at the circumstances. If at the end of the day it doesn't feel okay, I think it's fine to step back. I just do. Why would we continue in a circumstance that doesn't feel okay? If we can figure out that okay doesn't mean, well, I feel challenged in my practice, that's growth. That's okay. If I'm being mistreated, not okay. Do other people have comments about that? Doubts that you've encountered in your own practice, advice you can give, resources you have, or other things somebody would like to talk about today?
I'll add a little more to this.
Please. And then I think I saw Jeff's hand up too, so we'll go to him after you.
I'd like to just offer that I think it's important to approach this practice with an attitude of curiosity. So you're constantly open about where your mind is going. I mean, I think about how long we practice and I still feel like a novice. And to think about if you're doing it and committing to a daily practice, not negotiating with yourself, you see how different your mind is every day. Every day your mind is different. But there's something that comes through with this. At first it's a little trickle, and it's the Dharma, and the trickle becomes a little stream, and then the stream becomes a river. And so it's kind of like the self is diminished within that, and the Dharma starts to show itself. But it takes that zeal, that enthusiasm, and that curiosity to kind of allow that to happen.
And time.
Yeah, and time.
And it takes time. Yeah. Jeff, did you have your hand up as well?
I did. I was, well, first I just wanted to say thank you for another really fine talk. And one of the lessons I was realizing now for me was it's a good lesson in not clinging, because you present these tidal waves of ideas and I can't cling to it. There's no way or no time. So I was getting really frustrated, and then I realized it's actually a great lesson here and cling to these ideas. And then when I was earlier, I was going to comment on some of Hoshin's earlier comments, not from his last one, but the previous one. And Hoshin, twice you said, right in a row, just do it, just do it. And that phrase had come to my mind during the Dharma talk numerous times when you were asking us, Hoko, how do you do good without clinging to it, or to that idea. And it was a little weird to get this advertising logo, popping into my view, but it's just, well, you just do it and don't make a deal out. You just do it and go on to the next moment. So it's a little silly, of course, bringing this up in a Nike commercial, but that's what was happening. So, and then when I heard Hoshin say that, I couldn't not. I thought I should just mention it. So thank you. That's it.
That's certainly not the only time I've heard that phrase when someone's talking about practice. Mm-hmm. You guys aren't alone in that because it's a kind of a helpful thing, right? We don't think about what we're doing. It's not, we're not poking our heads in and writing a story. If we're truly seeing the nature of this one unified reality, then wholesomeness arises and we just do it. We just do the right thing. It's like you see the child playing in the street and the car is coming. You don't stop to think about what is the good thing to do here. You run out and grab the child and get it out of the way. You're not going to stop and worry about that. Now you may do that action and then look around and say, did anybody see me? I want to get a medal for that or a reward or something, so even in the moment of doing the good, we can still look back and cling. So, this human condition is is kind of complicated, right? But yeah, one would hope, if we're seeing clearly, that's exactly what happens in that moment. We just do it. And there's nothing extra. Okay, I see Hennesis and I see Shikaku. So Hennesis, you, and then we'll we'll keep going.
So my question, it might be slightly malformed, but I'm thinking about doubt and specifically the way that I often react to doubt, because oftentimes in practice, I have a lot of things that conflict with like certain values I have or things like that. Like oftentimes I don't really like meditating that much, except for like Kinhin, because for me, I have trouble sitting still, even to do things like watch TV or stuff like that. When I'm reading, I often walk with a book in my hand or something like that. And, oftentimes when I'm meditating, it's like I will tell myself, well, this stuff like is unpleasing to me, so it doesn't really matter. And then I will end up just overcommitting to it, or with certain like values and like, sort of our tradition's philosophy. I'll see a lot of contradictions with that and sort of the liberal and enlightenment values that Western society is built upon. And sometimes I think that too, my reaction to this is sometimes to sort of double down hardcore instead of like, I guess sort of reasonably having that dialogue, I guess. And sort of like, I'm wondering what the best approach to having these kind of doubts is, because it seems like the way I often do it is extremely black and white and dualistic.
Well, I think what Hoshin said earlier is important, and I think when I hear that, I immediately recall the story about Buddha, having a discussion with one of his students where he says, who's a musician, and he says, you play a stringed instrument. If the string is too tight, what happens? Well, it breaks. If the string is too loose, what happens? Well, then it doesn't make noise. So there's something about the middle way, that says we approach with a spirit of inquiry and a spirit of curiosity without being too rigid. And I know when I started to practice, I firmly believed there was one true way. And anything that was not traditional was not really practice. I was quite rigid about that. It took me a long time to open my hand and say, practice looks like a lot of things, and practice is a living thing. We can't even describe always, practice in this moment is not necessarily practice in the next moment. So I think if sitting is a problem today and walking is a useful practice, then let's walk. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I've certainly I remember being in Sesshin at one point where I don't know what was going on for me, but I could not sit down. I had to actually take several periods off and just walk. And I think that's a great practice. And if that's what the body needs right now, if we can sincerely say, that's what my body needs. I'm not doing it to distract myself or to get out of the zendo or because I'm bored. I sincerely need to do this now. Amen. Walking can work very well for that because we can be very grounded. Walking is a great way to just be in this moment because I've got to feel my feet on the floor. I've got to negotiate things. If we're really feeling abstracted and like I'm losing touch with self in a not good way, walking is a great practice. I encourage you. If you can't sit, walk. And it could be kinhin, but it could just be normal walking. It doesn't matter. Just like what's going on up here, right? But clinging to some idea about practice is always going to be a problem. And we all do it. We've all got some idea. We can decide all of this Japanese stuff is irrelevant to me, therefore it all needs to go. Or we can decide all of this Japanese stuff is the one true way and anything that doesn't look like traditional practice has to go, right? Or, somehow my personal philosophy has to line up 100% with everything that came out of the mouth of Buddha. Well, even Hojo-san says, this tradition teaches reincarnation. He says, I don't believe in reincarnation. That doesn't mean there's not something valuable about those teachings, but, it's like we've got to not be too, as you say, too kind of black and white. I think as long as we're approaching the teachings with a spirit of inquiry, we can be a part of this practice. We can engage in the practice. We can be part of the Sangha, part of the tradition, and not be I don't think there's a day where we don't have some little bit of doubt. It's like, is the doubt actually keeping me from getting on the cushion? are actually keeping me from participating. I think, you know, if it would be difficult to have a spirit of inquiry if we didn't also have some doubt. I think those two things are two sides of the same. So I think there's nothing inherently unwholesome in that because it's investigation. And investigation can be wholesome energy, right? Really digging into our practice can be wholesome energy. So I hope if those things are arising, that's not, they're not so strong that they're keeping us from participating. Because I think there's room for all of that. I think this is a big enough tent, right? You know, we're not asked to take it all on faith. We are asked to maybe look to our Dharma brothers and sisters and look to teachings and things for some guidance and some encouragement. But we all have to do the work for ourselves. And my practice doesn't look like your practice, and yours doesn't look like somebody else. And I think that's really okay. Shikaku, you wanted to jump in, and I don't want to ignore you.
Thank you for welcoming me. It's truly a pleasure to listen to you. I was talking to Tayun Sensei on Friday, and before our Dokusan, the phrase everything is the same but different came to mind, because I've been practicing for a few years, and it's like, well, is this working? In fact, very pertinent to your talk today, is this working? And I stopped and said, yes, because everything is the same but different. And then as I was listening today, and I'm thinking about things that Sangaku in our lineage and Tayun Sensei and you say, is many of these things are the same, but they're different. So thank you for your teaching.
So I should mention to everyone, Shikaku is coming to us from Atlanta. He's part of the Atlanta Zen Center, so we welcome him. Yeah, same and different is form and emptiness, is two truths, is, you know, practice and awakening are not two. I mean, that is a very strong theme in our tradition. As we know, I've said here multiple times, Hojo-san's explanation of the major theme of the Mahayana. We see one reality from two sides and express two sides in one action, and that's exactly what's happening. You know, everything is the same and everything is different. Both of those things are true. Other things people would like to say today? Mark, coming back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that's kind of coming to me like throughout this kind of conversation, it seems like Koshu Ichiyama's Zazen drawing is kind of like almost like kind of relevant to thinking about our whole practice, like as a thing. It's like we're not just kind of constantly on this one place, that there's sometimes this drifting away, and we might be in different places like on that spiritual practice, but it does, or on that spiritual path, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's regression that's involved. It's just like part of the practice is being all over the place.
Right, right. So, you know, you'll recall his drawing has a line called ZZ, which is Zazen, and then there's this wave, and we're either thinking or sleeping, thinking or sleeping, thinking or sleeping. So it's the activity and the stillness, it's the peace and progress, it's that whole theme in that one drawing about what happens to us in our Zazen. So certainly, sometimes we have restlessness and worry, sometimes we have dullness and drowsiness, we go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That is the content of our Zazen, right? So we can sit and experience all of those things and not put a yardstick on it, and it's all okay, right? Even though it maybe we have some idea about it's not okay to do so much thinking, it's not okay to fall asleep on my cushion. I should always be here. The reality is we move all the time, right? It's a fluid, dynamic thing.
I didn't Oceana say that the real, this isn't the right phrasing, but the real practice is the coming back to ZZ.
Yeah. We're coming back all the time. We're coming back all the time. So it's opening the hand. We're constantly opening the hand. We're letting go of sleepiness. We're letting go of thinking. We're letting go of our ideas about thinking and sleeping. It's just this constant letting go. So it's not, this is why I say it's not unrelated to, I do a good deed, I have to let go of the good deed. You know, I want to do good, but I have to let go of wanting to do good. I just need to be constantly, as soon as I see that I'm stuck, because all of that's about stuckness, right? As soon as I see that I'm clinging, I'm grasping, I'm stuck somewhere, I have to let go, because otherwise I can't move. I'm stuck here. So that, again, not unrelated to what Hennesis is talking about, right? I'm stuck in black and white. I have to constantly be going, you know, let go, let go, let go, let go, let go. And somehow still move through the world. which is an interesting intersection, right? In our practice, it's like we can't cling to anything, but we have to take concrete action. To me, that's a really interesting intersection to approach with a spirit of inquiry, right? I think that's our moment by moment life. What would others like to say this morning? Mahesh.
Yeah, so you mentioned when in your response, right? Like whether we think this practice is working for us or not. The other motivation is that we are doing this practice for others.
With
So
others.
can you talk about, yeah, for the benefit of others, right? Like how is that? Can you talk more on that?
Yeah, well, of course, that's another whole Dharma talk. So I'll just point to a couple of important teachings. One is the interconnectedness of all beings. We know that one of the marks of existence is that all things are interconnected. So if we're sitting and putting some wholesomeness into this world, we're doing that with all beings as well as ourselves. So even if I'm sitting today and I don't feel like sitting, and I don't think my sitting is going particularly well, there is some wholesomeness being generated there, which is not just for me. The same is true when we're about to do a service. We're about to chant a sutra, and what are we going to do with that merit? We're going to throw it back out to people who need that, right? So even we're generating merit out of our chanting and our liturgy, we're throwing that out to all beings. So whatever we're doing, we're not doing just here, which is why Hojo-san says, we might sit zazen in order to feel calm, or in order to have some benefit for ourselves or something. And that's why we approach this practice. It's what we do. We all, the first time we ever came in the door of a Dharma center, we were doing it for this one. Even though we're doing that, even though we might start out that way, we're also having to throw that back out to all beings. So to me, that's a bit of an encouragement. I know that if I'm sitting on the cushion and I don't want to be here today, there's things I want to be doing. I'm generating some wholesomeness in this world and throwing it out to other beings. I'm here because all other beings are supporting me. I don't live in isolation. It's not possible. Plants are making oxygen and someone is growing food, and somewhere there's a water treatment plant with workers that's making it possible for me to drink water. And we don't live separately. So I'm supported by all beings in my practice. And my practice also supports all beings. And we don't necessarily get that on an intellectual level. But somehow, some days, that's a bit of an encouragement or a bit of a motivation. Just to know that if I'm paying attention really to this one unified reality, it is not entirely about me. Any good I do is beneficial in the world. And, that all beings are also supporting me. So there's this giver, receiver, and gift happening here, which maybe helps us keep going a little bit, right? Any last comments? It's getting down to 11:26, and we still need to do a service. So I'm recognizing that people would like to have part of their Sundays for other things. Are there any last comments, questions before we move on to that? Clearly, I've raised huge topics today. That's why I say there's a ton to talk about on this gate. So. All right, so let's do our closing chant. Hoshin can do announcements while I do a little bit of setup here, and then we'll do our world peace. Okay?
I need to do a little setup too, so I'll do announcements first, though.
Okay, very good. Thanks for a good discussion today, folks.